holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy should itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Now, let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
Coming up, Technocracy News. Welcome to the broadcast. I am Patrick Wood, your host for today, editor and founder of the Technocracy News and Trends. I welcome all of our listeners from around the world, which is a surprise in recent days that we have picked up listeners in almost every continent in the world now. People are listening from Australia, New Zealand, from Europe, from Canada, a couple in Mexico. This is wonderful news for the spread of what we're talking about here, technocracy, and we welcome you. Please continue to share the word with your friends and stuff to get on board and subscribe to the podcast. It's available now in a lot of different places, by the way, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and probably a few others that I don't know about. But you can go directly to the source of it, which is contained at podbean.com, and you can search for Technocracy, and you'll pick it up there as well. There's a free app that goes on to your smartphone or tablet that can allow you to automatically subscribe, and it will notify you every time a new podcast has been posted. It's very seldom that we have three stories here back-to-back that are so critically important for the study of technocracy in a modern society. All three of these individually are key stories. I'm going to start out with the one that concerns the Green New Deal first, because the rest of them are going to kind of fall downwards from that. The headline of the story is Green New Deal, CFR interviews Senator Edward Markey. Now, the CFR is the Council on Foreign Relations. And those of you who have seen my book, Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order, know that my inspiration for the title came from an article that was written for the CFR back in 1974 by Richard Gardner. It was called The Hard Road to World Order. That's why I named my book, Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order. It has indeed been a hard road, and this was predicted and explained even back in 1974 and how this was going to play out. And it's played out pretty much the way that they said back then and the way that we documented back then as well. When I say we, I mean myself and Professor Anthony C. Sutton. Back in those early days, we co-authored 2 volumes of a book called Trilaterals over Washington, explaining the hegemony that had been established by the group, very elite group, the Trilateral Commission. Now, this article gives the transcript of the interview with Senator Markey. The interviewer is David Sandelau, and he describes himself as the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. By the way, Columbia University is where technocracy was born in 1932. He says, I'm delighted to be here for an on-the-record session with Senator Ed Markey. Now, just a little background here. Senator Markey has been in the legislature for decades. He's teamed up with House Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to sponsor the Green New Deal. So as AOC is to the House, Markey is to the Senate. Markey is an over-the-top radical that almost eclipses AOC, but this interview with the CFR is absolutely earth-shaking because he completely spills his brain, if you will, as far as the Green New Deal is concerned. Sandelau notes that Markey has been a member of Congress for more than 40 years. He was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1976 and then to the U.S. Senate in 2013. He's been on all kinds of committees, you just might imagine, ever since then. And he's just one of those people that never seems to go away. He's been there since 1976. It's a long time. That's as long as I have been chasing the global elite, starting with the Trilateral Commission back in 76, 77. And here we are today. Now, Markey starts out with a statement. I have to read the statement to you, and you need to listen to it carefully. You might want to replay this a couple of times just to get it. Of course, you can go and read it actually, too, on the website, technocracy.news. But here's what he says. The Green New Deal is a massive mobilization to transform our climate, our economy, and our democracy. Now, that lays out the groundwork right there. I'm giving comments as I read this. He's making no bones about it. The transformation, which the United Nations calls deep transformation, by the way, the transformation has to do with climate, economy, and our political system itself. Technocracy will replace all of these things, our economic system, our political system, and it will be driven by this irrational mantra concerning climate change. Now, he says, it is not prescriptive, but it is a set of principles that we lay out as a goal for the country. This is even worse than being prescriptive, by the way, because it leaves a wide open door to decide how would these principles be applied. Of course, he doesn't specifically say. He does a little bit. And he says, and it is as a result of a conclusion that has been reached as a consensus by the scientists of the United Nations and our own country. Pause for a second. This is a bald-faced misrepresentation. There is no consensus on global warming. Anybody that studies it for more than 5 minutes knows that there's no consensus. The so-called scientists that are pushing climate warming are political animals or those who are bought into the religious belief that climate warming somehow is connected to Mother Earth. He continues, so we begin by just making it clear that the United Nations and all of their scientists concluded at the end of last year that climate is warming dangerously, that the goal should no longer be 2 degrees centigrade, but 1.5 degrees, and that we have until 2030 before we start to see the real catastrophic consequences. And in the words of the United Nations scientists, that the threat is now existential to the planet. See, he's saying exactly what AOC said. 12 years, we're all going to die. He continues now. That's combined with the conclusion of 13 separate federal agencies at the end of 2018, which also issued a report. Because of a federal law passed in 1990, they must do so on the subject of climate change. Their conclusion was that if we continue business as usual, that the planet is going to warm by 9 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. 9 degrees Fahrenheit by the year 2100. He repeats himself. And that it could lead to a rise in sea levels of, in worst cases, 11 feet. So the magnitude of the threat is huge. And it is a consensus amongst global scientists and domestic scientists. It's no longer a debatable subject. Regardless of how much money the Koch brothers throw at the phony science, no matter how much greenwashing the fossil fuel industry seeks to engage in, the debate is over, he says. So thank you, Senator Markey, for telling us that the debate is over. You see, this is exactly the same thing that Al Gore has been saying for years. The debate is over. The consensus is in. The fix is in, so to speak, in my opinion. But deniers, at this point, will deserve nothing but punishment because of their foolish belief that this other phony science is phony. So Markey continues, so when you move to the next question, what are we going to do about something that could result in 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming? What are we going to do about something that could lead to an 11-foot rise in sea level? What are we going to do about forest fires that today will look like a preview of coming attractions in 30, 40, 50 years in terms of the level of damage which they're able to do to our planet? So we call for this bold transformation. There's the word transformation again. 10 years where we need a plan. We need to put in place the kinds of changes in our transportation, in our utility, agriculture, manufacturing sectors, and all sectors of the economy, he says. And it's not an option. He concludes his initial statement by saying, so that's our goal, and it has, in just 10 weeks, transformed the discussion around climate change. It's triggered a national debate. Everyone has a view on it now, and it is now injected deeply into the political debate of our country. And just for a frame of reference, in 2016, this is how sad it is. In 2016, neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump were asked a single question about climate change, an existential threat to the planet. Not a single question asked by reporters. How sad is that? The Green New Deal has solved the problem for 2019, okay, and 2020. we don't have to worry that people are going to not have this as a central question. They're going to have to be prepared to answer. This interview goes on and on and on with more dribble coming out of Markey's mouth. Markey should be ashamed of himself for spreading this kind of tripe to the world. But as the Green New Deal gathers steam, we need to just remember a couple of things that's going on around this. And Markey actually mentioned a couple of them. It has become a national debate. There's no question about that. If anything, AOC has been a lightning rod for this Green New Deal nonsense. And senators and congressmen have piled on to the bandwagon to follow her in this. And even if she's not the one that's driving the dogma right at this minute, she is definitely driving the debate. And she's got Senator Markey drawn in hook, line, and sinker. Where she's a freshman in the House of Representatives, Markey is an institution having served since 1976. He has power. He has political capital. He has influence. People look up to him, especially in the Democrat Party, but even Republicans look up to him as well. And when Markey speaks, people listen. Unfortunately, Markey is just speaking stuff that's absolutely unsupported. There is no scientific consensus that anybody with a brain can fall back on and say, yep, that's absolute science, and the science is settled. Science is never settled. This is all a political ploy to further the technocrat revolution, the Green New Deal, pure 100% sustainable development straight out of the United Nations. And I document in my book so very carefully that technocracy is sustainable development. They're equivalent. They're resource-based economic systems. They are not political systems per se at all. The only reason there's any political influence in this case, in AOC's case, is simply using the political system to perform this deep transformation. In the end of it, there will be no political system. Technocrats want to get rid of all politicians, elected politicians. They're dinosaurs. They're inefficient. They can't get anything done. They're completely disdained by the global elite that are pushing the Green New Deal. Nevertheless, they push it, even if their own jobs are going to come to an end. They think they're saving the world. They're not. They're destroying the world. The second article is pivotal as well. Close-knit financial oligarchy controls all major corporations. This is astounding research done by a researcher by the name of John Helvig. He has a blog. He obviously has a purpose in his research. And I suggest that these are the real drivers and financial benefactors of global technocracy. This report that he puts forth here is reminiscent of similar research compiled by the late Anthony C. Sutton and myself for our books, Trilaterals over Washington, Volumes 1 and 2. And we reached similar conclusions in 1978. Doing this type of research to correlate financial ownership is incredibly tedious and time-consuming, and is prone to inaccuracy because you stare at numbers too long and they start to dance on the page for you. It would be helpful to define what an oligarchy is, just in case you're unfamiliar with it. I'm looking at Merriam-Webster Dictionary right now, and the definition number one is government by the few. That is, in the case of a corporation is ruled by an oligarchy, a few. Definition number two, a government in which a small group exercises control, especially for corrupt and selfish purposes. Number three, an organization under oligarchic control. That is, a country is in an oligarchy. A few people control everything. That's the point. And in this case, John is making the conclusion that all major corporations are owned primarily by a very close-knit financial oligarchy. And this is shocking. It's not necessarily surprising, but to actually see it on paper is shocking. He writes, today's level of monopolistic concentration is of such unprecedented levels that we may without hesitation designate the U.S. economy as a giant oligopoly. From economic power follows political power. Therefore, the economic oligopoly translates into a political oligarchy. It seems, though, that the transformation has rather gone the other way around. A ferocious set of oligarchs have consolidated their economic and political power beginning from the turn of the 20th century. The conclusion that the U.S. is an oligarchy finds support in a 2014 report by Princeton University. Now listen to some details of this article. Institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, and J.P. Morgan now own 80% of all stock in S&P 500 listed companies. Let that sink in. 80% of all the stock in the S&P 500 listed companies. The big three investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street alone, constitute the largest shareholder in 88% of the S&P 500 firms, which roughly correspond to America's 500 largest corporations. Both BlackRock and Vanguard are among the top 5 shareholders of almost 70% of America's largest 2,000 publicly traded corporations. BlackRock had, as of 2016, $6.2 trillion worth of assets under management. Vanguard had $5.1 trillion, whereas State Street has dropped to a distant third with only $1 trillion. This compares with a total market capitalization of U.S. stocks, according to Russell 3000, of $30 trillion at the end of 2017. From 2016 to 17, the big three has, of course, also put on assets. BlackRock and Vanguard would then alone own more than 1/3 of all U.S. publicly listed shares. From an expanded sample that includes the 3,000 largest publicly listed corporations, that's the Russell 3000 index, institutions owned about 78% of the equity. The speed of concentration in the U.S. economy in the hands of institutions has been incredible. Still back in the 1950s, their share of equity was 10%. By 1980, it was 30%, after which the concentration has rapidly grown to the present day, approximately 80%. Another study puts the present stock market capitalization held by institutional investors at 70%. As a result of taking into account the common ownership at investor level, it emerges that the U.S. economy is yet much more monopolized than it was previously thought when the focus had been on the operational business corporation alone, detached from their owners. I highly recommend that you go to the website and click on this story. Again, it's titled Close-Knit Financial Oligarchy Controls All Major Corporations. Read the article, click through to it and read it, and look at the tables that are presented of ownership. There's been an incredible amount of work that went into this. I have respect for the author of this paper for going through that effort to do it, but you owe it to yourself to go in and look at the ownership and most importantly, the cross-ownership of these various corporations where the same names keep coming up again and again and again and again. Now, we suggested, Sutton and I did, back in the 1970s and early 1980s, that the concentration of financial wealth was exactly the plan that the global elite had back then. Oh, how it's played out in history up to the present day, going from 5 and 10% up to over 70% of consolidated ownership. This is why the middle class in our country has been decimated. The corporations that have accumulated wealth to themselves have displaced wealth owned by the middle class previously. This is how they gamed the machine. They have literally plundered the middle class. Now, I also have to say these are the same companies that are pushing sustainable development, green economy, the Green New Deal, the deep transformation. And even though they have accumulated all of the capital to themselves, many of these companies fully realize that there's going to come a day when capitalism simply isn't here anymore. And at that point, what will matter is not who owns the cash, but who owns the resources. Because resources are being migrated away from individuals toward a global common trust, controlled by them, of course. But the question in the future will be who owns and controls the resources of the world so that they can completely dominate 100% of economic activity everywhere. This is what sustainable development is all about. These are the companies that are doing it. These are the companies that will benefit and prosper from it. The people and the citizens in the middle are being squeezed out at record rates. The third story is absolutely pivotal as well. It's titled Free Cities, the Rise of City-States. I can't tell you how many times that I've discussed the issue of city-states in the past with people who are trying to figure out what technocracy is all about. But when Dr. Parag Khanna came out with his book, Technocracy, a few years ago, it became very clear exactly where the global elite was taking the world. Clearly, they wanted to displace or reduce the importance of the nation state and give autonomy to the global cities of the world in order to connect them together to create a superfied supply chain to feed the global economy. Parag Khanna made it clear in his book, Technocracy, that this is one of the driving forces of globalization, is to connect cities together and basically take their leadership away from their national governments and turn them into city-states. Now, this article talks about free cities, very closely related. It's not exactly 100% the same as a city-state, but it's very, very close. If you've been a fan of Game of Thrones, the HBO series that has runaway viewership, you'll understand the concept of free cities, autonomous city-states, modeled after the ancient Roman era. Today, free cities are being promoted as the structure du jour to replace the nation state. This is a key element for technocracy to succeed, by the way. I've described that carefully in my book, Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order. But in this case, an historian writes this paper. It starts out, a GOP lawmaker in Illinois recently introduced a bill that, if passed, would ask Congress to consider making the city of Chicago its own state. You heard me right. The city of Chicago becoming its own state. Of course, the author writes, no one really expects this bill to pass. Even the congressman who wrote it admits that he only introduced it to highlight Chicago's disproportionate influence in the state of Illinois. Chicago holds more voting power than the largely rural rest of the state for a reason. More people live there. More money is made there. More happens there. But because voting choices in Chicago are historically different from those in rural voting districts, fair representation across the state is a growing concern. This illustrates how political divisions in North America and Western Europe run only along the fault lines of race and class, but increasingly divide the rural heartlands from the major cities. This is a divide with real consequences, from Brexit to polarizing politics following the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and it seems like it's only getting harder to fix. But what if instead of trying to mend this cultural schism, we embrace it? And what if a solution for a better future came from far, far in the past? If we look back to ancient history, one model makes a strong case for this approach. Quote, the free city. She says that a free city is a largely independent municipality that is not subject to local and regional authorities and has its own representatives in federal or imperial bodies. They were particularly important in the Holy Roman Empire that persisted through the Middle Ages, which was when cities became sites of progress, development, and culture. Free cities largely disappeared as a result of the rise of the nation-state in late medieval and early modern period. But it was a model of governance that worked for centuries. In medieval Italy and Germany, free cities were unencumbered by the authority of regional lords, but nonetheless participated to a limited degree in the imperial government. Still, free cities had their own laws and elected their own magistrates. They controlled their own trade and regulated the movement of people in and out of the city limits. She notes on the free city today, by recreating the free city model today, we might be able to address some of our biggest struggles in society, from the immigration crisis to the rise of populism and mounting trade wars. This is an amazing article. It's not written from our perspective. If you don't like technocracy, you're going to view this article, of course, as being on the other side trying to promote it. That's why I bring it up in the first place. The rise of the city-state is going to ultimately displace national sovereignty and the whole concept of nationalism and the nation-state, and the cities are simply going to take on a life of its own. There's a big story behind all three of these things here today because they're all pivotal about the implementation of technocracy in the world. First, again, to review, Senator Edward Markey unloading his Green New Deal rhetoric to the Council on Foreign Relations, and then a massive research paper that gives graphical proof that a financial oligarchy controls all major corporations in the world. And then a story pandering to the concept of global cities or free cities as being the new social construct that will lead us into a progressive future. This is all about technocracy. This is carefully documented in both of my books on technocracy. The first one was Technocracy Rising, the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation. The second one is Technocracy, the Hard Road to World Order. Both are available on my website at technocracy.news as well as on amazon.com. And if you don't like to read a physical book, there's a Kindle version there too. I hope that you'll spread this podcast around to all the people you know and encourage them to subscribe to it and to get in the stream. You can always go back and read any story that I talk about here on the website or content in my books. In some cases, I'm bringing stuff out of my books to support these stories. But please pay attention to everything that's been published today. This is so critically important to understanding technocracy. I'm Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. Bye for now.